Just why they had decided to become his sworn enemies, Gary was not sure. Maybe it was because he sat at the front of the class, or they played around at the back. Perhaps it was because he was a clever kid who could solve a maths question in a jiffy in his head, while Nick and Dick were both as thick as two short planks. I mean, Gary could solve pretty complicated maths problems, while Nick and Dick had a job deciding that 2 and 2 made 4. Whatever the reasons, Nick and Dick had decided that Gary should become the next victim in their campaign of bullying other kids at school. After all, he looked a dirty little weed. They were both quite big boys and knew that Gary would not be able to fight them, especially as they worked together. So they had first of all taken to calling him names, like Gary Gormless instead of Gary Gormley. It didn't take much to make all the other kids join in, partly because they were afraid of Nick and Dick, and partly because kids just like calling other kids horrible names. So Gary was soon known as Gormless Gary. This was all a bit stupid of the kids, as Gary was without a doubt the cleverest boy in the class. He had brains to spare, which should have made the other kids envy him, but all the other kids could see were the rather shabby clothes he wore. That was because Gary and his mum were poor. His dad had died when he was young, and his mother was ill and not able to work. She spent a lot of time in bed, and Gary had to look after her. He didn't have time to make a lot of friends, and the spare time he had, he usually spent in the shed at the bottom of the garden, where he invented things. Yes, Gary's hobby was inventing things. True, he hadn't invented too much yet, just some things like a toilet seat warmer for their outside loo, which got very cold in the winter, and a radio-controlled mouse scarer to get rid of the mice that constantly invaded their home. But then, Gary didn't want lots of friends. In fact, he didn't want people to see the rickety house he lived in with his mum. But now these awful kids seemed to have his number. Gary remained very still as he heard voices coming from round the corner. "Where is he? We'll get him this time. Let's bash the brainy little pig. Look, there's a puddle we can tip him in, make his clothes muddy." Gary's heart sank. Clothes were difficult to come by in his family, and the last thing he wanted was to get the clothes he wore messed up by the bullies. They'd had a go at ruffling his hair and rolling him around on the school playground, but now it looked like their rotten little games were going to get bigger. Suddenly, Gary heard another voice. It was the voice of a girl. "You looking for Gary Gormley?" He caught his breath as he heard his name. "Yes," it was the voice of Nick. "You know where he went?" "He went that way, through the hedge and over the field." "Right, let's catch him up. Maybe there's some muck we can throw him in." "Hurry," said the girl's voice. "He runs fast." Gary heard a couple of grunts of thanks from the two bullies as they made off. He breathed a sigh of relief, but was startled to hear the girl's voice. "All right, Gary Gormley, you can come out. They're gone." She said the last word in a singing, laughing sort of voice, so it sounded like gone. Gary poked his head out. What he saw standing there was a young girl the same age as himself. She had freckles on her face and chestnut brown hair, which was plaited into pigtails. Even though boys of his age weren't supposed to care about girls, Gary thought she looked rather pretty in her red dress, which reached to her knees and the black booties on her feet. He recognised her as a girl from his class at school, Emily Truss. "They after you again?" asked Emily. "Yes, afraid so," said Gary, looking at his feet rather than into the girl's eyes. "Guess they've got it in for me." "They've always got it in for someone," said the girl with a kind of pout, which Gary thought was very cute. "Well, thanks for seeing 'em off," he said. "Oh, my pleasure," said Emily with a shake of her pigtails. "I can't stand those two. They're as thick as pig's muck, and all they want to do is to throw their weight around. I wish I was a boy," she said, narrowing her eyes and throwing little punches into the air with her clenched fists like a boxer. "I'd sure whip them both." Gary laughed. "I think you might need to be a bit bigger," he said, looking at her admiringly. "Guess so," she said. "Mind you, they'd never pick on me." "Why not?" said Gary. "Because I've got a big, big brother who will see to them," she smiled. "At least, that's what I told them. And they are so stupid, they will believe anything." "So, no brother?" said Gary. "No, but I've got a dad. He would sort 'em." "I haven't got a dad," said Gary as he kicked a stone aside and they started to walk up the road together towards home. "I've only got a mum, and she's often not well. I have to look after her most of the time." "Sorry," said Emily. "Is that why you don't go out much?" "That and my inventions," said Gary. "You're what?" "It's what I do. I'm an inventor. Well, only little things at the moment, but one day I'm going to be a real inventor." "Caw," said Emily. "I'd like to see them sometime, but at the moment I have to get home for tea." "Yes, and I'd better get home and see how Mum is." "That's really kind of you, looking after your mum," said Emily with a concerned look. Then she chuckled. "My mum and dad say they have a job looking after me." Gary watched her walk up the road to her house and realised he'd made a friend. That felt good, he thought to himself. If only there weren't Nick and Dick to worry about tomorrow.